here and already, full of questions and ideas about ways that the talks prior to this connect to what I'm doing. My name is Anita Woolley. I'm going to be trying to squeeze what I thought was going to be a 40-minute talk into 22 minutes. So we might be jumping over a few things. So let me just acknowledge first the collective that has been part of many of the studies that I'm going to describe today. And start you off with just a quick example. So often if you Google collective intelligence, or those of us who do work in collective intelligence often start with examples from the animal kingdom. Because there are some pretty impressive examples of ways in which different species are hardwired to attune to the cues given off by other members of their group so that they can closely coordinate their activities to accomplish some pretty impressive things. So for example, ants are individually very simple. They don't have a whole lot of memory capacity. They don't have a lot of problem-solving capacity. But collectively, they do some really impressive things. They create some fairly complex structures in terms of engineering. They carry things that are many multiples of their collective body weight, et cetera, et cetera. And so we actually started being more interested in humans than animals, wondering the degree to which any of these ideas would generalize to human groups. So we certainly all know that there are human groups that excel in very specific domains. This is a photo of the Orpheus chamber orchestra. It's a world-renowned chamber orchestra that is known for being conductorless. They operate under a system of shared leadership. So we wondered, though, since there's no doubt that groups like Orpheus are great in the musical domain, would it be the case that there are pattern regularities within human groups such that some groups can excel in many domains over time? And if so, could we capture that to then better understand what it is that contributes to this brand of collective intelligence and use it to predict which groups will perform well in the future? So we started our thinking and our theorizing about collective intelligence in groups by building on ideas of general intelligence and individual psychology. So general intelligence is defined to the degree that the researchers define it as the inference you make and the observation that people who do well on one task tend to do well on tasks in many different domains. And this would be in addition to specific sorts of intelligences or skills that would be in very specific domains. Now this work was originated in part by the work of Spearman early in the 20th century based on the observation that school children who did well in one academic subject tended to do well in many different academic subjects. He went along to explore that empirically and devised the early precursors of what we all know as factor analysis. And so while there's a lot of controversy in society in general about what intelligence is, what leads to it, et cetera, the empirical observation of intelligence is probably one of the most replicated in all of psychology. People who do well in one domain tend to do well in many other domains. And it's pretty impressive that we can give somebody a test in a relatively short amount of time and use that to predict how they're going to perform not only in school, but in terms of their career, whether or not they'll become an unwed teenage parent, and even life expectancy. So many domains and over long periods of time. So we wondered the degree to which we could generalize these ideas to teams. Is there a general collective intelligence in groups, one that would translate across domains and over time? Can we isolate a small set of tasks and use that to measure the collective intelligence of groups and predict how they'll perform on a broader range of more complex tasks? And importantly, would this C factor, for collective intelligence factor, would this have predictive validity above and beyond the intelligence of individual members? Prior to the beginning of our work in this area, when we thought about intelligence in groups, it was as a function of the intelligence of individual members. What is the average intelligence? What is the maximum intelligence? What does that predict about how the group would perform? In order for collective intelligence to have practical utility, it would need to predict something above and beyond knowledge of the intelligence of individual group members. And finally, can we use this to actually build a better science of collective performance? Up until now, when we've looked at performance in teams, we're often constrained to using some fairly limited criterion variables, whatever we can get in that particular context, without knowledge of the degree to which that generalizes to other contexts and over time. If we had a more valid and reliable criterion variable to use, that would then help us to generalize our findings across different sorts of contexts. in much the same way that having a well-validated measure of individual intelligence helped the field of individual performance move forward in a more coordinated manner. So these were our modest goals starting out. And so in our initial paper on this, we reported a few studies. The very first one involved just a small set of 40 teams. We had them come into our lab. They spent basically the whole day in our lab doing a bunch of different tasks that we sampled from different domains. We tried to draw tasks that were from the established literature in Teams research. We also gave them measures of individual intelligence. And so in sampling tasks, we were guided very much by some established taxonomies in the literature. One well known is by Joe McGrath, where he identifies 4 different types of tasks that require qualitatively different sorts of processes for teams to collaborate. So a generate task would be your traditional brainstorming task where you're trying to develop as many and as varied ideas as you can. Choose tasks would be your traditional decision-making tasks where there's a single correct answer the group needs to arrive at. An execute task would be a general psychomotor task where the group has to carefully coordinate their inputs and accomplish something or a large quantity of things very quickly and accurately. And finally, a negotiation task involves the trade-off of competing motivations and objectives to arrive at the best answer for the group. So we chose tasks from the literature, sampling from these different domains. So one thing when you're developing an individual intelligence test that you look at, well actually there are 2 main things. One is the average inter-item correlation, and you want to see that the items are, the average correlation is statistically greater than 0. And the second is the first principal component, and on a general intelligence test that usually accounts for between 30 and 50% of the variance across all the items. And so in our sample, we found that the average inter-item correlation was 0.28. It was significantly greater than 0, and our first principal component accounted for 43% of the variance. And so in putting this into a confirmatory factor analysis, we did find that the best fitting model supported a general collective intelligence factor. When we used that to predict how these same teams performed on a video game simulation that we brought them back to perform a few days later, we found it was a significant predictor of their performance on that task, and much more so than the average IQ of individual members. And the same held true if we looked at maximum IQ, etc. We did a second study. I won't go through all the details, but we sampled slightly different tasks. We had a different criterion task, and we found a very similar pattern of results. And so for those of you who spent a lot of time doing factor analyses, this is what the scree plot looked like for our first study. And then our second study, and for comparison purposes, is what the IQ test scores looked like for our sample as well. So the factor structure of our collective intelligence battery was very similar to the factor structure of well-established tests of general intelligence. And then looking at the relative predictive value of our C factor versus intelligence scores, we found that the collective intelligence scores of the groups predicted much more variance in the criterion variables that we used. This was average intelligence, and this was maximum intelligence for our 2 studies. So we've gone on to try to use our battery to predict performance in a few other contexts. In one study, we studied some MBA student teams at CMU. We gave them our battery at the beginning of the term. It predicted how they did on a desert survival simulation a week later. It predicted how they did on an organizational change simulation 3 weeks later. In another study with some collaborators in Germany, we found that our battery predicted how these computer science teams did on their project 2 months later. And we're in the process of trying to do some more of these studies in conjunction with different organizations. So I'm going to quickly, I think, go over a couple of other studies. So we've been interested in the degree to which collective intelligence predicts other things about groups. And so reaching back again to the literature on individual psychology, one thing we know is that IQ in individuals is a strong predictor of learning. Individuals who are smarter are better able to adapt and make connections across between material they know and new material to progress faster in novel tasks. And so we were wondering if the same would be true of teams. Are teams that are more collectively intelligent quicker to learn? So we looked at this in a couple of different contexts. In the first one, we looked at it in the context of a minimum effort coordination game in the lab. And this is a game where the group plays in multiple rounds. Individuals make make choices without communicating with team members, but what they are paid is based on the combination of what they choose and what every other member of the group chooses. So over time, group members need to get better if they're going to make more money at predicting what other members of the group are going to choose, so that in combination it results in their earning more money. They can actually lose money if they make the wrong choices. And so this is just a graph of how the groups performed across the rounds of our game. They played 10 rounds. And just for display purposes, we split the groups into the groups that were high in collective intelligence versus low. The yellow line are the groups that are low in collective intelligence. What you can see is that the groups start at approximately the same place. If anything, the groups that were lower in collective intelligence on average were doing a little better on the first round. But as they go across the 10 rounds of the game, you see the groups that are low in collective intelligence, they kind of improve, and then they do worse, and so on, and they end up not much farther ahead of where they started. Whereas the groups that were higher in collective intelligence start down here, and there's kind of a steady progression upward until in the end, they're making significantly more than the groups low in collective intelligence and significantly more than they were at the beginning. So fairly steady upward progress across the 10 rounds of the game. And then this is an analysis looking at basically the learning curve across these. And what was interesting to us is that individual intelligence of group members was predictive of performance until we factored in collective intelligence. And then what we saw was that the collective intelligence of the group was much more predictive. In a second study, again in the MBA classroom, this was a course where it was taught using an approach called team-based learning, where students would complete a short quiz on a unit by themselves at the beginning of class, and they would then work on the same problems with their groups. So we had a measure of how they did on the test by themselves, and then how their group did as a whole. And what we were interested in seeing was how the groups that were higher in collective intelligence did compared to those that were lower in collective intelligence, and how they improved over the course of the term. Because all of the teams took our CI battery at the beginning of the term. So here's a graph of the results. The groups that were higher in collective intelligence improved over the course of the term, much more so than the groups that were lower in collective intelligence. And then what was most interesting to us was to look at how the groups performed relative to the best members of their team, because as I told you, we have the individual test scores, and so we wanted to see if the smartest group in the smartest person in the team did better or the same or worse than their team as a whole. And what we found is that for the high CI teams, they consistently outperformed the highest scoring member of their team on all of the tests, whereas the groups that were lower in collective intelligence did not, and in fact, in some cases, they performed slightly worse than the best scoring member of their team. So the groups that were higher in collective intelligence got better over time, what we infer, at identifying who might have the best answers to each of the questions, or maybe combining what they know so that they can complement each one another's gaps in knowledge and actually do better overall. So now that I've told you a little bit about what we have found collective intelligence can predict, and we've shown you that some evidence that individual skill and individual intelligence is not necessarily the strongest predictor of collective intelligence, it raises the question as to what is. And so we've looked at a number of things. First is that we looked at a lot of things about group climate, and I don't even have them all listed here, but things like group satisfaction, cohesion, motivation, etc., using well-established scales. And what we consistently find is that there's very little relationship between these and the collective intelligence of the group. We've given participants in various studies a variety of personality measures and have found no consistent relationship between these personality factors and the collective intelligence of the group. One thing that has been surprising, and that has emerged over and over in various studies, is that the proportion of women in the group seems to be strongly predictive of collective intelligence. And so we've actually now done a number of studies, as I've mentioned, and we've aggregated this data. We just did this like within the last week, so this is kind of new analyses. And what we're finding is that really what's happening is that once females become the majority, so here in this graph, 0 is the average, because these are standardized scores. And so once females are in the majority is when we see the huge jump in collective intelligence of the group overall, where, and again, I've kind of put together groups that are different sizes. So that's why we have these categories where we have, in some samples, or well, in all samples, we have groups that only have one female, but sometimes, those are the same. Groups are only counted once, basically, and so this is just a way to show you, like, when it's a majority, but not the token male, so it wouldn't, or a token female, if you can follow that. So, and not all groups would be even numbers, so not all groups are represented here. But anyway, so what we see is that you really don't get above average collective intelligence until females are in the majority. And then we see a slight decline when the group is all female. What's that?
Not so slight.
We are needed, not so
Oh,
slight.
that's right.
Just one of them.
There's some really interesting analyses of the process as a function of having token males and token females in the group. And one study that is interesting and complementary to this in some way shows that when you have a token female in an otherwise all male group, the female doesn't contribute very much, and effectively you lose the benefit of that person's participation. However, when you have a token male in an all-female group, that person participates a lot, and so do the women when they're in the majority, and so you actually have more participation overall in the groups that are of these compositions. So that's something we're actually starting to explore a bit more in some studies we're doing now. Another factor that seems to help explain the effect of the proportion of women in the group is social perceptiveness. So in several of our studies, we've given our participants a test that looks like this. It's called the Reading the Mind and the Eyes test. And so they answered 36 items including pictures of just the eye region of the face, and they have to make inferences about what this person might be thinking or feeling. So what do you think this person is thinking or feeling? So this is a very perceptive group. This is actually one of the more difficult items on the test. It is. No. If you look in the stats, it's one that has fewer. No, I'm not kidding.
It's because many of us have seen the store. That's why we know.
Maybe that's right. Okay, so I had some plants. That's good. This test was initially devised by researcher Simon Baron Cohen, who studies autism and autism spectrum disorders. It was originally designed to screen people for those disorders, but then they found that it was actually a relatively difficult test, even for those in the normal end of the spectrum. And so it's actually been shown to predict sort of social intelligence and managerial effectiveness in a few different studies now, as well as be a strong predictor of collective intelligence in groups and in our studies. Women on average score higher on this test and others like it than men, just in our sample and just in the population. And in most of our samples, it predicts most of the variance. It mediates the effect of the proportion of women on collective intelligence. So then another piece that we've looked at in a few settings is communication. And so these are badges that were devised by Sandy Pentland's lab at MIT, and we used these in our studies. We were interested in conversational turn-taking and variance in speaking turns. And what we found is that groups where the conversation is dominated by one or a few members are significantly less collectively intelligent than those in which communication is more evenly distributed. I'm going to jump over this because I want to get to this part. So we have been working on a new online battery to try to measure collective intelligence more quickly. As I mentioned, in the early studies, people came for most of a day to do it. Now we have a set of tasks that we can give groups in 60 minutes or less, and we can do it online so that they don't need to be together face to face. So we've done an initial validation study of this, and we used it with some groups that were actually working together around a table using laptops versus separated and online to take a look at what this would predict and if it would be equally predictive in these two contexts. And so this is another factor analysis just to show you comparing the two studies that I showed you earlier to the online and the face-to-face samples in the current studies. And what we found is that the factor structure of our battery is identical across these contexts, which is surprising to us. We also were able to gather communication via chat on our interface. And what we find is a very similar pattern to what we see with spoken communication, that better groups chat more and they chat more equally across members, and that this is strongly associated with the collective intelligence of the groups. And then looking at proportion of women, we found similar patterns, although stronger patterns actually in the online groups in terms of the effects of the proportion of women on the collective intelligence of the group, which is really interesting to us because one thing we realized after the fact is that we're not totally sure if the groups that were online knew which other participants were women. So they were not using video conferencing, it was simply chat. They could choose their own chat names, but the degree to which it would be clear to them that the other people they're participating with are women is not totally clear. And so we're now thinking about a way to run a study where we can manipulate that to see the effects of, is it that you perceive that others are women and that changes your behavior, or is it something else that they're doing that simply facilitates the work of the group, whether we realize they're women or not. Another interesting finding from this is that the social perceptiveness test was just as predictive, even in the online groups of collective intelligence. So there's something about this skill that translates into communication via this very limited interface, because clearly people couldn't see each other's eyes, in that setting. And so just to give you a sense of the overall patterns and the consistency across them, this is the relative strength of prediction of the R&E test for collective intelligence, amount of communication, standard deviation. This is standard deviation of speaking turns in the face-to-face speaking groups versus the chat, so it was even stronger there. And then the other thing that was nice about this new online interface is we could actually track who is contributing to the solutions and track the participation of that. And so distribution of participation to the actual work itself was also strongly predictive of the collective intelligence of the group. So just to kind of wrap it up, across these studies and even more that we have ongoing, we see consistent, strong evidence for the conclusion that there is a C factor that seems to characterize the performance of collectives and also to predict group learning. And that there are these features that surface over and over again that are strongly predictive of collective intelligence that have to do with really the ease of transfer of information. So the quality of contribution would enable more information to get into the group. Social perception is one way in which group members could facilitate the translation of information across members. And I skipped over these, but we've also looked at diversity, especially cognitive diversity, and what we find is that you need a moderate level, but not too much cognitive diversity in a group to facilitate collective intelligence. And so we're already starting to think of ways that this might connect to some of the network science work that is going on, because we're very interested in looking at these ideas in the context of very large groups and very large online groups. And so, questions that occur to us thinking about that is the degree to which networks could be designed to produce collective intelligence as consistent performance across domains of tasks and over time. What are the qualities of the networks that would lead to high levels of collective intelligence? Are they the same? I would suspect that they're parallel to what we've looked at in the domain of teams. And then what is the relative contribution of individual capability versus network capability or network characteristics in determining the collective intelligence of the network? Is it true that you could actually come up with a brilliant network by having fairly average skilled individuals but connected in ways that are high quality and that facilitate the transfer of information as a whole? So these are, I'm sure you have even more questions. These are some of the things that we've been thinking about. So I'd be happy to open it up for discussion.
I think it's very interesting. Oh.
No, it's you.
Then, okay, so very interesting work. I guess one question would be, are you willing to speculate about what you think the mechanism of that is? I mean, you have some data that suggests it's probably not cognitive ability, although there may be some issues about how that gets represented. It's really hard to, I think, represent in terms of diversity. But what do you think is the underlying mechanism that accounts for the results?
So as I started to go into at the end, I think coordination and information transfer are really key parts of this, right? And so everything that comes up that is strongly predictive of collective intelligence points back to those sorts of mechanisms.
So do you have plans then to have a kind of a task, some kind of a paradigm in which you can pull out those processes that make that link a little bit more direct, where you've got the behavior or the actual communications where here was the information transfer that was critical? Because I think that would really help to nail it down. The task part's a little bit of a black box from what limited amount you showed us.
Right. No, absolutely. I think that's another feature of doing this with an online tool where we can really sort of control and capture a bit more accurately what's going on. So that's exactly one of the paths we're going down now. Thanks.
Cool.
I'm very interested in how you'd fix a bad group. So can you teach them to be socially perceptive? And does that indeed then give them better collective intelligence?
So in terms of the data, I know that I keep saying I should move this microphone around. In terms of the data on altering individual social perception, it's fairly pessimistic in the sense of the effects of training on moving these abilities. But one thing that we're actively exploring and thinking about in our future studies is ways to amplify the sorts of cues that people who are highly perceptive are good at picking up, to make them sort of perceivable by those who might be a little denser in that respect. And so there's some really interesting work, and we're involved in a project in the area of stigmergy. So it again starts with collective intelligence in animals and the ability of different animal groups to pick up signals and use that to coordinate collective activities and translating it into more the human domain. So what are the signals that are key to helping human groups coordinate, and how could we make those more readily available to all members, and especially when you start thinking about online environments and distributed environments, what are the signals that would be key to facilitating interaction in those environments. That's great.
Anita, hi. I thought this was really interesting. I had two questions, if I may.
Sure.
One is, beginning just from the question that was asked, some of the dynamics that you expose are kind of the enduring things we know make for a good team. We also know that those enduring characteristics never last in a team. The team inevitably goes down the path of sharing only their common information. It's called the common information effect. People, start to be less perceptive of each other's behaviors. They make more assumptions. So one question I have for you is collective intelligence actually sustainable? Because if it does go down the path of being a bad team, what does it mean? So that would be one question. The second question I have is, around us all the time, we always have this notion that if you just, hire the best people, the smartest people in the room, you'll do better. I mean, we do this in this room all the time. Every time we hire somebody new, let's get the best athlete. But your work says that that's actually not the right thing to do. So my question is, why do we go on doing something that's not the best? Shouldn't we have observed that it's suboptimal? So those two questions, that's what I'm interested in.
So your answer would be immediate. Too few men on the committee.
Right. No, I think your first question is interesting, and it's the type of question we run into a lot in the sense that I think the approach that we're taking in looking at collective intelligence is sort of fundamentally different than some of the research streams you're referring to when you talk about the dominant patterns of groups. So there's a research stream that says the dominant pattern of a group is to focus on shared information, to fall into mindless routines, etc. What we're kind of saying is actually there are some groups that operate in a very different way than other groups, and what we're trying to, and so another way to translate that question is, do highly collectively intelligent groups fall into those patterns to the degree that the dominant approach would suggest?
But you have to observe them over a long
Right,
period of time.
right,
There are
and
a lot of
that's
trials to know that.
Right. So, but a hypothesis we have is that actually there are groups that are fundamentally characterized by patterns of interacting that don't sort of descend into some of these negative tendencies that you're pointing at. And so maybe then if we can put in place the building blocks for collective intelligence in more groups, we would see less of that behavior. That's one way of kind of posing that. But, and I would say absolutely, I mean, in sort of longer versions of this talk, I spent a little more time thinking about, so there's this, predominant tendency still to focus on individual attributes, individual characteristics, and trying to compose what, your work shows is fundamentally a collective enterprise, right? And I think it really does require a change in mindset, but it also requires better measures, because right now our best measures are things that point at individual attributes. We have good measures of collective, of individual intelligence. We don't have well-established measures of collective intelligence, so we focus on individual intelligence. So if we get better at having metrics for identifying who's going to contribute more effectively to a collaborative enterprise, maybe then we would be better at making arguments for why we should focus on those qualities rather than the individual qualities.
So is this Moneyball?
Yeah, I mean,
It's
in
Moneyball.
some ways. Yeah, it is. It's,
Yeah.
Just wondering.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, this is, when I was thinking about the importance of these mechanisms of coordination and information transfer, it brought to mind, and also the incorporation of network structure, brought to mind Michael Kern's work on graph coloring, which is a way of demonstrating the remarkable collective intelligence of humans, which in some ways is surprisingly high. I think he generally has been really surprised at how good humans are at solving these very difficult coordination problems. But their focus has been mostly on the structure, and I don't think they've really incorporated nearly as much of the individual, the node level attributes that you're looking at. So it might be an interesting collaboration or to bring those two streams of research together. So for example, I don't believe they've ever, I may be wrong about this, I don't think they've ever manipulated the gender composition in any systematic way, and that would be really interesting.
Yeah, that's interesting. So Michael's somebody we have talked with actually about collaborating, and I'm not aware that they do that either.
Yeah. So thanks, Anita. Actually, I had a lot of questions, and a lot of them you've already addressed, but I had one other, and that is about the degree to which collective intelligence is idiosyncratic to a particular group. So for example, you have a group that's very highly collective, high C. If you take those people who are part of that high C group and you move them to other groups, what happens?
Mm-hmm. That's actually so there are a few different variants on that sort of question that we've been thinking about, and I think that's another area we'd like to go into. So one is how much membership change could a collective sustain and still maintain their level of C? But then the other is, are there certain individuals, and actually the Army is interested in this, are there certain individuals that you can plant into groups who will create high C in those groups? Yeah, and so, some of the individual differences we've looked at point to some things, but I'm sure there are still other qualities and capabilities, because I have to believe that has to be true of some people, that they're able to at least, spawn the right sorts of patterns in the groups that they're in that would raise the probability of C being higher.
So actually, I think that, to me, that's a perfect segue to why looking at the network configurations of a group of people might explain the variability, why a certain group of people, through their structural connections, might have different collective intelligence. But that was a comment. My question is actually, I'm channeling a question from the Twitter sphere, from somebody who's watching this live and who was supposed to be Jay Goodwin from the Army Research Institute we talked about a minute ago. Yeah. And because of the government shutdown, so he's left to watch the stream, the video stream.
Okay, hi Jay.
And so his question is, can we tell the relative contributions of social perceptions, evenness of communications, and gender balance on collective intelligence?
Yeah, so that's an analysis we've done. It's in our published paper, and it's in some of the others that are under review. And usually the factor that figures most prominently if we do the regression with all of them is social perceptiveness. Yeah.
I wonder how much this scales. Does it go from, okay, one is not a collective, but from 200,000 people? So what is is it the same collective intelligence? That's one question. The other question is I was intrigued by a plot, the scree plot, that showed actually the first factor in the collective intelligence is above the individual intelligence first factor weight. So it means that it's even more in one dimensional. There's even more clear in the collective that there's one intelligence score, which is to me really striking, because I thought that okay, maybe IQ in individuals is really more one-dimensional, but groups can be so varied in their function. There's a group good for a creative task and a group really good for a functional task. So just a comment that I was surprised. Am I misunderstanding something? Or?
No. I mean, I think I think that's been the consistent observation across our data, our studies. But in terms of scaling up, that's right. We just actually got an NSF grant to look at this with respect to group size, and so I don't know if we'll go to 200,000 per se, but we are definitely planning to go, an order of magnitude bigger than what we looked at, and thinking about the degree to which this scales. So I think it's a great question.
I'm fascinated by the framing of the token male, right, as opposed to the lone male, or the single male or single female. Is there a reason?
Or the alpha male.
Or anything. I mean, is there a reason that you're calling those individuals tokens?
I think I'm drawing from the diversity literature. So Denise Lloyd and some others who are doing a lot of work on this, look at it as a function of the token, because a lot of times when a setting is homogeneous and they look to integrate people from an underrepresented group, the initial representatives of those are considered the tokens.
So it's just a consistent nomenclature.
Yes.
No framing meant.
I mean, when we are assigning individuals to groups, it's actually random. So I'm showing you, a bunch of studies integrated, but when we put people in teams, it's random. So we haven't actually said, okay, we have this group of girls, and we're going to take Nash to be our token guy. That's not quite how we're approaching it.
You can blame Roosevelt.
I think it was Roosevelt Moscato who first used
So,
token.
You probably don't have data about it, but the thing that comes to mind is, what is the effect of multi-team membership? In many cases, people will be members of multiple teams. So I'm wondering, does it require that people are at least to some particular percentage of the time member of the team for the C factor to really sit in, or for the C factor to have an effect on the performance? And similarly, what would happen if you look at different teams with different levels of overlapping membership? Would you expect that the extent to which the membership is overlapping would also create a higher correlation between the C factors of these teams? Because that would indeed strengthen your argument that it is the interaction of these particular people, and that people will tend to interact the same way in different teams.
Yeah.
But especially people being part of multiple teams, and so spreading their cognitive attention across different teams. I would be interested in what your idea is, whether that would affect the C factor or the effect of the C factor, or would there be kind of a threshold for that? Or?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, because as you probably know, I'm also interested in multi-team membership, but I haven't looked at these things empirically together. But my intuitions, I think, follow yours, which is that the membership overlap would tend to create, correlations across the C factors of the two teams. If you had people who are members of a lot of teams without that overlap, I would say that because of the mechanisms that we've been talking about with coordination and information transmission, that we expect the C factor to decline in those cases, because if they're paying less attention to any particular focal team, then we would expect that the C factor would be lower.
Question, can you separate out at all in your C factor the kind of component of it that's driven by kind of altruistic cooperation for the group from kind of other components? And the reason I bring that up specifically is your two animal examples at the beginning of the talk are altruistic cooperation, right? That's maintained by recognition of kin signals in ants or in meerkats. And in evolutionary anthropology, which is like my home discipline, there's a lot of our theory, and we have some evidence that that signaling signaling was brought up before, signaling specifically of ethnicity or religion, that this was key to the evolution of large-scale cooperation, particularly among non-relatives in humans. So just what kind of component of C factor, do you have any sense of that? Is it 30% of it? Is it 50%? Do we have any way to measure that out as a separate piece? The willingness of people in the group to take a risk on behalf of a group benefit that might cost their prestige or their time or.
I think in the studies we've conducted thus far, that isn't something that we've looked at, and I'm not sure how we would. I'd have to give that some thought, but I think it's a great point. What about the ways that people behave in these collectives is driven by some of the motivations that you're pointing to, versus alternatives. So, but no, it's not something we've looked at, and I'd have to talk with you more, I think, to think about what data we would have to try to break that out. It's a good suggestion.
So I have a question also. Going back to this aspect of individual versus team, and you mentioned that it's easier or has been easier to measure, or someone mentioned that it has been easier to measure individual intelligence or individual factors, and so the focus is on there. But I wonder if that focus is because, people have a tendency to look for the hero or the person that determines outcomes, and this is very common even in scientific fields, right? There are a bunch of people that contributed a lot, and then there is one person that is assumed to have solved the problem or something like that. And long intro to, could people's own perception of who contributes to developments, so I could have a perspective that, well, individuals may be important, but actually it's more the collective, versus an individual, a person that thinks, no, there is usually one person that solves the problem. Would that also, do you know if that is any indicator of how well people integrate into teams or not? Their perception of who solves the problem. Is it the hero or is it the collective?
I would suspect so. I think another piece of this that gets brought into the conversations with some audiences is culture, right? So the search for the hero is definitely an individualistic sort of Western lens on how things work. So the degree to which that would be true in other parts of the world and other contexts, I don't know. But we know that it does definitely impede the kind of collaboration that we think most contributes to C. And the main indicator we have of it, again, is this distribution of contribution and conversation. So if leadership is enacted by having somebody do all the talking, what our data suggests is that wouldn't, in fact, enhance the performance of the group. And so if it's more of a equal participation, which would suggest more of a collective contribution, then that would be favorable.
Suppose you had an online task group in which you crossed the actual gender composition of the group with the perceived gender composition.
That's right.
You have that?
No, we don't. That's
So which one do you think would be more important, the actual or the perceived in terms of the collective intelligence?
Yeah, my intuition is that it's the actual, but it has been suggested by my husband, among other people, that knowing that women are around changes the way the guys behave, right? And so that's exactly the type of design we would need to pursue, in order to try to tease them apart. But I think, we have a strong intuition that there are certain things that the people who are higher in social perception, which, on average is the women, are doing in the group to facilitate the work of the group, which would maintain whether it was known they were women or not. But that's exactly the type of design.
You should look at Ron's recent AJS paper where people change genders and how they play online games.
Or Sam's work on diversity.
Yeah.
So last question, so you can go for lunch on time, sorry.
I want to ask someone
I
else.
don't want to stand two men in line.
Do you think you're tapping into process loss or some sort of social facilitation? Where I'm asking is that when we look at collective intelligence and we're comparing basically against the pool of individuals, is it that if you have a cluster of really bright folks that they get stifled and they can't channel their energy and it's process loss? Or is it that we have perhaps weaker players that are rising way above which we would normally consider to be their ability to contribute because of some sort of synergistic thing that are happening in education?
So overall, I think there is a synergistic explanation, and I guess I draw most into the MBA class example that I showed, where the individuals were taking the exam, and then the group was taking the exam, right? And so there, the group was outperforming their best individual, and so. But certainly there's the other side of the story, right? Which is what's happening with the groups that were low in collective intelligence, and especially when they weren't even outperforming the best person on the team. So, my suspicion is both factors are at play, obviously, especially as you look at the different parts of the distribution of collective intelligence. But, right, but I think those are cool.
So let's all thank Anita for her great presentation.